At dawn in 1941, the skies over the Pacific carried a new predator. The Mitsubishi A6M sliced through the air with grace and lethal intent, piloted by young men trained to perfection. For Allied air crews, the Zero was not just an enemy, it was a specter that seemed untouchable. Agile, impossibly light, and capable of dogfighting maneuvers no Western aircraft could match, it quickly earned a reputation as the most dangerous fighter in the world. When the war began, Zero pilots were already veterans of years of conflict in China, where they had refined their tactics. They entered the wider Pacific War as masters of the sky, confident and precise. For American and British pilots, facing a Zero meant fighting an opponent who seemed to defy the laws of physics. The aircraft could climb faster, turn tighter, and remain airborne for distances few believed possible. The Allied air forces were shaken. Fear became a constant companion whenever the telltale silhouette appeared. Midway through those early battles, Allied reports told of entire squadrons annihilated in minutes. Pilots described desperate spirals and last-second dives, only to be outmaneuvered by Zero aces who struck with surgical accuracy. It was said that one Zero could take on 5 opponents and emerge victorious. This was no exaggeration. It was the daily reality of 1941 and 1942. If you're fascinated by these untold stories of World War II, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this journey through history. The fear was not unfounded. In the first 6 months of the Pacific War, the Zero's kill-to-loss ratio exceeded anything ever seen in aerial combat. Its pilots, bound by discipline and honor, embodied Japan's dream of dominance in the air. Each victory reinforced the image of the Zero as invincible, its pilots as warriors elevated above mere men. But beneath this early supremacy lay hidden cracks that would, in time, widen into a tragic downfall. For now, though, the Zero and its pilots stood unchallenged, feared across oceans, their legend only beginning to unfold. The strength of the Zero was not just in its engineering, it was in the men who flew it. Japan's pre-war training program was among the most rigorous in the world, designed to produce not just pilots, but warriors bound by loyalty and discipline. Candidates faced grueling physical tests, sleepless nights of study, and endless hours in the cockpit. Only a fraction survived the process. Those who did emerged as elite aviators, prepared to sacrifice everything for the emperor. The Imperial Japanese Navy treated flying as a sacred art. Cadets practiced aerial combat until it became instinct, honing skills in mock dogfights over the home islands. Instructors demanded absolute precision. Every maneuver had to be executed flawlessly. Mistakes were not tolerated, and the weak were weeded out without mercy. The result was a corps of pilots whose confidence bordered on unshakable. By 1941, this system had created a cadre of aces unmatched anywhere in the world. Men like Saburo Sakai and Hiroyoshi Nishizawa became legends, credited with dozens of victories. To Allied flyers, these names became synonymous with terror, whispered in briefing rooms before missions. For Japanese society, they were heroes, the embodiment of Bushido in the skies. But there was a cost to such perfection. The training pipeline was so demanding, it could not be replicated on a massive scale. Japan entered the Pacific War with a limited pool of these elite pilots, a resource far more fragile than it appeared. Every loss at the front was irreplaceable, every downed ace a wound that could not heal quickly. In the early battles, however, none of this was visible. What the Allies saw were men who fought with unyielding courage and unmatched skill. Their tactics emphasized ambushes, lightning-fast attacks, and devastating accuracy. Squadrons moved as if they shared a single mind, their discipline overwhelming opponents who relied on improvisation. The Zero itself was feared, but the men inside the cockpit were the true weapon. They carried the weight of their nation's hopes, and in those first years of war they gave Japan an advantage that seemed unshakable. Yet, even here, fate was preparing its counterstroke. In the first year of the Pacific War, Zero pilots carved their legend across an ocean. From Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, from Malaya to the Dutch East Indies, their presence reshaped the balance of power. Wherever Allied aircraft rose to meet them, the outcome seemed predetermined. The Zero and its pilots emerged victorious, their dominance total. The aircraft's unmatched agility allowed for tactics that Western planes simply could not counter. In a dogfight, Allied pilots found themselves trapped in spirals and turns that drained their energy, while the Zero danced around them, striking with deadly bursts of machine gun and cannon fire. To American crews in outdated P-40s and F-4F Wildcats, the battles felt hopeless, like fighting a ghost that could vanish and reappear in an instant. Reports from the field captured the desperation. Entire squadrons were wiped from the skies in minutes. Pilots who managed to escape returned with tales of opponents who seemed untouchable, their reflexes faster, their aircraft more alive. The Allied command realized it faced a crisis. The Zero was not just another fighter, it was redefining air combat itself. Victories piled up. At Rabaul, Zeros decimated incoming bombers before they reached their targets. Over Burma, British squadrons learned to dread the sudden appearance of enemy fighters that could strike and vanish before reinforcements arrived. And across the Pacific Islands, Marines bracing for invasion looked up to see Japan's sky warriors clearing the way with merciless efficiency. But perhaps the most devastating effect was psychological. Fear spread faster than any aircraft. Allied crews entered missions already doubting survival, morale crumbling before the battle even began. In the early war, Japanese Zero pilots were not merely opponents. They were the embodiment of inevitability, the sharp edge of Japan's expanding empire. For a moment, it seemed nothing could stop them. Each victory reinforced their aura of invincibility. Each battle deepened the Allies' sense of helplessness. Yet behind the soaring triumphs, unseen forces were already at work, forces of technology, production, and strategy that would eventually turn the skies from a domain of dominance into a stage of tragedy. By 1943, the Zero's supremacy began to falter. What once seemed like a perfect war machine was slowly revealed as a fragile design. Its unmatched agility came at a terrible cost. Thin armor, unprotected fuel tanks, and a lack of self-sealing systems made it dangerously vulnerable when struck. Against lightly armed opponents, this weakness went unnoticed. But as newer Allied aircraft entered the war, the Zero's flaws grew impossible to ignore. The arrival of planes like the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair changed the equation. Heavier, faster, and armed with superior firepower, these machines were built to withstand punishment that would destroy a Zero instantly. When American pilots learned to avoid turning battles and instead use diving attacks, the advantage shifted sharply. The Zero could outmaneuver, but it could not outlast. Fuel shortages compounded the problem. Japan's oil reserves dwindled as Allied submarines strangled supply lines. Training flights were cut, reducing the hours new recruits could spend in the cockpit. The once expert system that had produced elite airmen now churned out inexperienced youth with barely enough practice to survive. Veterans were dying, and their replacements lacked the skill to match their legacy. On the front lines, this decline became evident. Squadrons that once struck fear into the Allies now faced overwhelming losses. Reports described formations breaking apart under heavy fire, Zeros spiraling down in flames before even reaching their targets. The aura of invincibility was cracking, replaced by the grim reality of attrition. For the Zero pilots themselves, the change was devastating. Many felt betrayed by an aircraft that no longer gave them the edge. They still flew with courage, but courage could not compensate for fuel shortages, inadequate training, and outdated machines. Their missions grew more desperate, their survival more uncertain. The legend that had begun as an unstoppable force was shifting into something darker. The Zero was still dangerous, still capable of striking, but the balance of the war had turned. From here onward, every mission carried not the promise of glory, but the shadow of tragedy. As Japan's air war entered its most desperate phase, Zero pilots faced impossible orders. With Allied fleets advancing across the Pacific and bombers reducing Japan's cities to ash, commanders turned increasingly to tactics born of desperation. The once feared aces of the early war now found themselves flying missions that offered little chance of return. By 1944, it became clear that Japan could no longer match Allied production or technology. Instead of conserving its dwindling supply of aircraft, the Imperial Command demanded bold strikes, no matter the cost. Squadrons were ordered to launch against overwhelming numbers of Hellcats and Mustangs, often with little preparation or fuel. Many never returned, consumed by the inferno of superior enemy firepower. And then came the darkest chapter, the rise of the Kamikaze. For many Zero pilots, this was not a choice, but a command, a final sacrifice for the Emperor. Stripped of hope for victory, they were expected to trade their lives for a single blow against the enemy. Zeros, once symbols of agility and supremacy, were now packed with explosives and turned into human-guided missiles. For the pilots, the emotional toll was immense. Some accepted their fate with stoic resolve, believing their deaths would protect their families and honor their nation. Others faced it with quiet despair, forced into missions they knew were futile. Diaries recovered after the war reveal men writing farewell letters before takeoff, their words heavy with duty and sorrow. On the Allied side, these attacks created new waves of fear. Ships burned, crews were killed, and entire fleets were shaken by the sudden fury of kamikaze dives. Yet even here, the strategy could not alter the outcome. For every ship struck, Japan lost another irreplaceable pilot, another aircraft that could never be replaced. The tragedy of the Zero pilots was no longer just about battles lost. It was about men sacrificed in a war that had already slipped beyond saving. Their skill and bravery remained, but they were being consumed in a cycle of desperation, their destiny rewritten from warriors of the sky to instruments of final sacrifice. By the time the Allies closed in on Japan's inner defenses, the skies had become a proving ground for industrial might. For every Zero that rose to defend the homeland, 10 American aircraft waited to meet it. The imbalance was staggering. The once elite Japanese squadrons, now filled with barely trained recruits, found themselves hurled into storms of steel they could not withstand. The P-51 Mustang dominated long-range escort missions, ensuring American bombers reached their targets unchallenged. The F-6F Hellcat swept Japanese fighters from the skies with brutal efficiency. Even the Thunderbolt, heavier and slower to turn, could dive with crushing speed and rip through a formation of Zeros in seconds. Against such machines, the once revolutionary Zero felt like a relic from another age. For the young pilots forced into these duels, survival was nearly impossible. Many entered combat with less than 100 hours of flight training, compared to American pilots who logged triple that time before their first mission. Inexperience showed, maneuvers faltered, formations broke apart, and Zeros were picked off one by one. Veterans who remained could only watch in despair as their comrades fell in droves. Meanwhile, Allied pilots had studied the Zero's weaknesses. They no longer entered into turning battles. Instead, they relied on speed, altitude, and coordinated attacks. Dive and zoom tactics exploited the Zero's lack of armor and vulnerability in high-speed dives. Where once the Japanese pilots dictated the terms of engagement, now the Americans controlled the fight. On the ground, the effects were just as devastating. Airfields became graveyards of charred wreckage, bombed before planes could even take off. Factories struggled to replace losses, their output crippled by shortages of fuel, aluminum, and skilled labor. The sky, once Japan's shield, had become its Achilles heel. The Zero pilots fought with determination, but determination was no match for an enemy that seemed limitless. For every sortie flown, the Americans returned stronger, while Japan grew weaker. The stage was set not for glorious victory, but for a heartbreaking collapse that would forever define the fate of the Zero and the men who flew it. By 1944, Japan's air war strategy shifted from calculated strikes to acts of sacrifice. The once proud Zero pilots, symbols of skill and daring, were now being molded into instruments of desperation. With fuel scarce, factories destroyed, and veterans gone, Japan's high command turned to a grim tactic, deliberate one-way missions. Kamikaze operations, while shocking to the Allies, revealed the extent of Japan's collapse. Young pilots, some barely out of school, were instructed that their aircraft itself was a weapon. Stripped of armor, carrying explosives, and with only enough fuel for a single flight, these men were told to crash into enemy ships. For the Allies, it was terrifying. For the Japanese pilots, it was tragedy disguised as honor. The Zero, once celebrated for agility and finesse, became the vessel for these desperate assaults. Its light frame, once a blessing in dogfights, made it a deadly missile when directed toward naval decks. American carriers and destroyers braced themselves daily for the sudden shriek of a diving Zero, flames trailing behind as it crashed into steel hulls. Damage was inflicted, ships burned, sailors died, but the cost to Japan was unbearable. Each kamikaze strike consumed a pilot who might have carried on the traditions of Japan's early war aces. Instead of dueling in the sky, they were consigned to fire and destruction. Veterans who had once fought at Coral Sea or Midway now trained boys for missions they knew would end in death. The pride of Japan's aviation was reduced to sacrifice on an industrial scale. Allied commanders viewed the tactic with both horror and grim respect. They understood that these were not reckless madmen, but men caught in a system that gave them no choice. Still, the impact was limited. For every ship damaged, the Allies built another. For every kamikaze pilot lost, Japan had no replacement. The descent into kamikaze warfare signaled not courage alone, but despair. The clearest sign that the Zero's glorious chapter had turned into tragedy. What began as dominance in the Pacific skies was ending as waves of hopeless sacrifice, a story written not in victory, but in blood. When the war ended in August 1945, the skies over the Pacific fell silent. The Mitsubishi Zero, once the terror of Allied pilots, was left scattered across islands, jungles, and airfields, broken shells of a legend that had burned too brightly. For Japan, the Zero was both a source of national pride and a haunting reminder of loss. In the early days, Zero pilots were worshipped as warriors without equal. Their kill ratios astonished the world, their skill seemed untouchable, and their bravery inspired a nation. Yet as the years dragged on, their story became one of sacrifice and futility. Thousands of young men never returned, their lives spent in battles they could not win. Families received only photographs, medals, and silence where sons and brothers once lived. For the Allies, the Zero represented two sides of war. At first, it was a nightmare, fast, elusive, and merciless. But as technology advanced and strategies evolved, the Zero also became a symbol of how even the strongest advantage can be overcome. New planes, radar systems, and sheer industrial might eventually swept it aside. Still, those who fought against it never forgot the skill and ferocity of the men who flew it. Today, surviving Zeros rest in museums, restored and preserved, their sleek frames admired not for destruction, but for history. Visitors see not just a machine, but a story, a nation's rise, its desperate fall, and the lives of countless pilots who lived and died in their cockpits. The Zero's legacy endures not only in records of combat, but in the lessons it left behind about innovation, sacrifice, and the cost of war. The tale of Japan's Zero pilots is not simply one of fear and tragedy. It is also one of human resilience, courage, and the stark reality that even the most feared warriors cannot escape the tide of history. Their journey began with dominance, burned with unmatched intensity, and ended in sorrow. Yet their story remains immortal, etched forever in the skies of World War II.